Welcome, dear friends and comrades, to this 9th No2Nato broadcast. We already had the plague, now we have the war, so that's absolutely logical that they start to treat us with the famine. Ukrainian grain blackmail is intended to soften hearts of the public opinion in the West, and at the same time, that's multiply profits on all those interested in continuing that war. Today, we have absolutely fantastic guests, panelists, who will discuss together with me about some very important and sometimes forgotten issues of this war propaganda. We try to think how global neoliberal food and chemical industry would like to take the power over food supply to Europe, to Africa, and what can we do together to prevent this new totalitarian regime. Please let me welcome our noble guests, fantastic, brave brains. Please let me introduce first Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards.
This is very ironic what's going on with the temporary ban by these EU member states, mostly Eastern European countries, because this temporary ban on Ukraine grain exports to the EU was meant to end on the 15th of September. And it now seems like there's a power struggle going on with the EU Agriculture Commissioner, Janacek, I forget, I'm not very good on his Polish name here, but his Janusz Wojciechowski or something. Essentially, it seems like he's now pitted himself against Ursula von der Leyen and the EU elite because Poland has elections towards the end of this year. So they are not keen to alienate the rural voter and the farming population of Poland by continuing to allow Ukrainian grain to flood Polish markets. So he wants to maintain the ban on Ukrainian commodities coming into the EU, while you've got this elite in Brussels who are now publicly disagreeing with him and saying that he's overruled, which is an incredible situation to be in. I used to work in the European Commission for a year back in the 90s in DG6 agriculture, and this type of situation, I cannot remember this ever arising, where you had the agriculture commissioner at loggerheads essentially with the rest of the EU leadership. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this pans out. But I mean, obviously, the agriculture is a major issue for many voters throughout the EU. And previously, there were a lot of issues with France, and French farmers would bring their trucks to Brussels and pour fertilizer or pour cattle mark on the streets outside the European Commission offices. So I think it's fascinating to see how the Poles, who are meant to be the Ukrainian sort of number one ally, are actually wanting to maintain this ban, and the Ukrainians are pretty furious about it and saying that they're going to be taking the European Commission and these countries to court. So we'll see what happens over that.
Yes, as a paradoxical situation. I believe that even more that Janusz Wojciechowski, DG Agri chief, as you mentioned, is a Polish politician, member of the Law and the Justice Party, so ruling strongly pro-American and pro-Ukrainian, pro-Kiev regime party. So seeing him now with all these contridances theoretically against Kiev policy and against Kiev demands is rather funny for me as a strong opponent of the Polish pro-American, pro-Anglo-Saxon, pro-Atlanticist government. Let's go further, because it's not only question of the Ukrainian Brussels relations, but something maybe much deeper and strongly related to the global food industry situation and agriculture situation. And I would like to ask Dr. George Szamuely about this aspect. We all know that great international corporations like Monsanto, like Dow DuPont, like BASF, and not only, of course, them. They are very active in the Ukraine. They now hold more than 5 million hectares officially, of course, of the Ukrainian land. And well, that's only part of the truth. That's not the part of the military industrial complex involvement in the Ukrainian war. But well, considering exactly this aspect, do you think that, well, starting from the agriculture, starting from food industry, is the Ukraine the gate for the American corporations, global American corporations, and neoliberal global corporations? Is it the gate to enter to European market and take control over that? First, starting from the food industry, but then taking everything else under the strong economical neoliberal American hegemony, even stronger than now. What do you think?
No, that's absolutely right. Well, let's keep in mind that one important piece of legislation that followed the coup of 2014 that overthrew the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, one of the important pieces of legislation was to liberalize the buying and selling of land, meaning that foreigners could buy land. So Ukraine, which of course is very rich agriculturally, did indeed become the playground of a lot of very wealthy corporations. And we've seen with the whole Hunter Biden scandal. I mean, that was all part of what happened immediately following that coup. I mean, when Hunter Biden got this position at Burisma without any knowledge of oil, gas, energy, Ukrainian, Russian, or anything. He never even visited Ukraine. But that was part and parcel of what happened following that coup. And as I say, an important ingredient was the buying and selling of land. So now with these US corporations owning large chunks of land, they suddenly found themselves they weren't making any money, because Ukraine wasn't able to ship its grain out through the Black Sea. And so these corporations weren't making money. And so they got very indignant about it. And they got onto the United States government and say, you got to do something. You got to, we got to get this grain out. I mean, we bought this land. We want to make some money on this grain. And hence, the whole international hysteria generated by the Western media, which is mass starvation, global starvation. I mean, unless Ukraine is able to get its grain out, there'll be, millions of people are going to die of hunger. This was an artificially created hysteria that led then to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And as we found out subsequently, very little of this grain actually went to the hungriest and poorest countries of the world. I think it was something like 3%. And that's not the figures provided by the Russian government. That's the United Nations figures. The 3% went to the poorest countries such as Djibouti and so on. So to answer your question, yeah, it's absolutely part and parcel of the United States moving in, taking over the assets, both agricultural and industrial, not just of Ukraine, but of Europe as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. There is no business like war business.
That's right.
And when we observe these names only, this repeating Biden, Nuland, McCain, and so all these dynasties, right, connecting politics and big business, really big business, we can find almost all of them in Ukraine. That's absolutely true. Yeah, but you mentioned the Black Sea Agreement, and I think that would be the moment we ask Dr. Membe about the very strong propaganda element of the Black Sea Agreement, because as we all remember, the main argument for this agreement between Russia, Ukraine, granted by Turkey, and with silent acceptance of the West, was that this is the food for the hungry people in Africa. That was the main argument in which especially Ukrainian government, but also Western government try to explain that agreement. But as we all know for now, almost all Ukrainian grain didn't came to Africa at all. They all have been sent to the Western Europe through Poland mainly and Romania. Now they are food storages full, grain storages full of this, well, questionable quality Ukrainian, or in fact American, international, global grain. And it was not Ukraine, but Russia who sell more than 10 million tons of grains to Africa last year, 11 tons of grains against in the half of the years 2023. So what is all about? It's not only a question who can feed Africa, because we all know that Africa could easily feed itself if only no colonial power let Africa to do that. But Dr. Member, as an activist, as a journalist, as a stronger researcher in all this hidden part of geopolitical and geoeconomical relations, do you think that this element of the grain blackmail, but also of this whole war propaganda, is also about Africa, is about preventing a new anti-neocolonial wave in Africa? Is it the Africa they want to control over everything else? Because they have control over Europe, they have control over Ukraine, but Africa is still able to be liberated by themselves. Dr. Member, what's your opinion?
I don't think they have cared so much about the food security of Africa. If they had cared so much about the food security of Africa, Africa wouldn't be where it is today in terms of food security. It would be much better. Even when there's famine in parts of Africa, they don't respond so dynamically, so aggressively. Africa has never been dependent on Ukraine for food security, for food supplies. This is a consequence of the war they started themselves. And they should bear the consequences of it. They shouldn't put Africa to be the burden bearer. In Africa. And it's not what Africa needs to survive. If they are concerned about our survival in terms of food security, there are so many things they can do. Yes, we need agricultural inputs. When were they concerned about the lack of agricultural inputs to sustain agriculture in Africa? And who has supplied Africa with more grain over the years? Ukraine or Russia? Is there a war? It's a war they instigated, a war they started, and let them bear the consequences of it. And it's sad that Ukraine is allowing itself to be destroyed in this way. Agriculture in Ukraine is being decimated by this conflict. But there are people who benefit. There is capital that benefits from this conflict, both in terms of agriculture and in terms of the war itself. They are benefiting from this war. That's why they don't want the war to end. That's why they don't want talks to start and end this war. What they are saying is not in the interest of Africa, and they are not doing it because of Africa. Africa wants the end to that conflict. Africa wants a much more secure world. Not only a secure Europe, but a secure world for all of us. This planet will not be a good place for any of us to live on unless it's good for all of us. War doesn't increase food security. A food agency. NATO is a destructive agency. It's an organization that endangers food security. It increases the possibility of wars. And we know that wars lead to food shortages. War destroys agriculture. And that's what NATO, what the USA and its partners in NATO have brought to Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine did not start with a special operation by Russia in Ukraine. It started before. As it was put, it started precisely about 2014. It was very clear that we are headed for a conflict. Violation of agreements was the order of the day. So let them deal with the consequences of a conflict they created, over a war they started. For us, our duty is to ensure that there's no war. And also to ensure that we do not see an expansion of NATO. What we want is a contraction of NATO and the disappearance of war blocs like NATO. Thank you.
Remember, I would say that I agree with absolutely everything, and I would only add that when I hear that the most humanitarian action towards to feed hungry Africans is to be held with the help of companies like Monsanto, so company who invented and produced Agent Orange in Vietnam for Vietnam War, which destroyed millions of hectares of the Vietnamese land and preventing any kind of any kind of agriculture. So that's absolutely clear for me that these people, these forces, are interested only for creating new market for their also famine industry, because it is a famine industry, the same like a war industry involved in conflict like this one in Ukraine and many conflicts in Africa as well. We all know about it because they are all part of the same neoliberal, imperialistic, neo-colonial policy of America, but also of other northern Western powers. Thank you very much, Dr. Member. And let's return for the moment to Europe. Returning to Dr. Edwards, I would like you, could you please explain it? Because it's hard for me to understand as for a Pole. As a Pole, I cannot understand why our puppet government, because they are puppet governments in Poland, in Romania, in Baltic states, especially in Lithuania, also in Slovakia, with interesting exception for Hungary, for Budapest, of course, which is absolutely different from the Bucharest and Warsaw position in that conflict. Why Americans, who so easily use this government, these capitals, these puppet states, for example, in any kind of argue with Europe, they easily used Polish veto against an attempt to create some common policy of the European Union. They easily try to scare Brussels bureaucrats that, okay, they can create some kind of smaller pro-American union with these vassal states of the East. Any kind of any wishes of Washington are absolutely followed by Warsaw, Bucharest, Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. So now they ask only for a small period of quiet. Yeah, just give us a couple of weeks just to hold the election, just to keep farmers quiet, to some kind of a piece of any kind of protest, farmer protest, which was very strong in Poland, and well, we didn't get even that. Yeah, Kiev said, "Okay, you are not our friends anymore." Washington is absolutely silent, and no support voices come from there, neither from Westminster. So, how they treat the most the most involved believers in Warsaw, in Bucharest, in the Baltic states? Why they do not support their people in Europe? Dr. Edwards, what do you think?
Populace or the elites? Which people are you referring to, Konrad?
Well, I would say that especially I'm surprised that, of course, it's not surprised. This kind of positions of the especially pro-American Polish government, for example, which evidently counted that Americans do something to support their position that, okay, we want to stop Ukrainian import for the couple weeks. And Washington said absolutely nothing about it. So there's no support for American colonies. So American colonies like Poland, like Romania, like Lithuania have to support any gesture, any declaration of Washington and Westminster with, of course, no positive response from their side. For Polish people, it's another Yalta retreat.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Ban on the messiness of politics at different levels. It's not a straightforward Washington can come in and make a decree. The Polish need to get re-elected if they want to continue this war. And so they are going to come up, they're coming up against the politics of the EU, and then the countries in different parts of the EU, those who are on side with NATO, as you say, the Baltic states and Poland and so on. And then others such as Hungary, who want to protect their national interests, and who, I mean, Viktor Orban, it was quite clear from his interview last week with Tucker Carlson, he's far more pragmatic and he's far more supportive of his own populace and their own ability for sovereignty and self-determination and so on. I was very struck last year, actually, when I'm in Switzerland and I was in a ski resort, and there were some Polish people some Hungarians who were working in the resort, in the hospitality business. And on their day off, they took the train to Bern in order that they could vote for Orban to get re-elected. And they were young Poles, and it was quite a long journey. Young Hungarians. And it was a long journey for them with several changes on the train. And I thought, I can't see British people really showing the commitment to actually go and vote for someone that they feel that strongly about. So unfortunately, we don't have many leaders like Orban in Europe, and we seem to have become subsumed into this sort of EU supranational superstate. Obviously, the Brits have tried to do Brexit, and it hasn't been a great success. They've been sabotaged left, right, and centre. And yes, it looks as though we're about to see the effects of this large agribusiness, DuPont, Monsanto, and dare I say Bill Gates, who I think has been buying up land in Ukraine as well. He's certainly bought a lot of agricultural land in the United States. So if they're not able to export their commodities through the Black Sea ports and the price of grain surges, then I imagine they've got a fairly good hedge, because they own so much land in the United States and they will somehow profit from those higher prices. But it is horrifying to see how Monsanto, which wasn't able to successfully argue its case with European people 20, 30 years ago when it was trying to push GM crops into Europe, maybe ultimately, its position in Ukraine is going to really enable them to flood the rest of the European Union with genetically modified grains, which they will not segregate, because in America you don't have a choice. There's no segregation of GM and non-GM, so that the consumer has the right to choose. It's all basically shoved in together. So no respect for the consumer. It's the big corporates, and you know, their desires are is very much above that of the citizens of Europe.
Yeah, that was exactly my next question, because I'm seriously concerned that it's not only my opinion, but also farmer unions, not only in Poland or in Romania, which I consulted with that, but also opinion of Ukrainian farmer unions, of course, which are now banned in this pro-democratic and government, independent government, because all the unions were forbidden and banned in this in the Kiev's regime, under Kiev's regime. But that was exactly Ukrainian farmers who first observed genetically modified soya in Ukraine, and very shortly after that, Ukrainian government, well, with the very shy and delicate communicate that okay, it could be observed somewhere, but no one exactly knows where and in what amount. What I believe is not a very good information for anyone, that they do not control even what enter the Ukrainian market. Well, the worst is that we still don't know if it doesn't came to Europe, which is theoretically, of course, forbidden. But I can strongly confirm that there is absolutely no control over Ukrainian food import to Europe. No quality, no sanitary control over that. Even in Poland, which is theoretically banned that practice. So we cannot say if the genetically modified soya isn't in Europe now, and it would be absolutely tragic consequences for European, not only farming, but for any kind of food industry if we allow this soya and also this modified grain to enter our market, our food industry, our bread producing, anything. Yeah, that's absolutely drama. But you mentioned a very important thing. I would like to ask also Dr. Szamuely, because you said about the Britain's situation and how British consumer and voters in the same time react on the situation. We all living in Britain observe the same increase in the food prices. We can observe the same elements of the same results of war policy, like before COVID policy, and on the living conditions of people living in the UK. So, how do you think, why this consciousness about the situation, about the truth motives of our governments, of our politicians, are still result in so weak reactions? Why people do not react even in voting, even if not protesting? I know the perfect statement of Ambassador Peter Ford, who said exactly that there is no leadership, no left in Britain. But well, why do you think people are still do not scared enough the situation, which could be even only worse, also for Britain? What is your opinion, Dr. Szamuely?
The success of Brexit has given people a very misleading idea about Britain. I mean, it was presented as Britain makes a big bid for independence. Britain asserts its sovereignty. Britain asserted nothing of the sort. Britain may have left the EU, but it became ever more subsumed under the United States. I mean, Britain is now effectively a satellite of the United States. Britain does not have an independent foreign policy. Britain does not have an independent nuclear deterrent. Britain does not do anything that isn't signed off on by the United States. So therefore, it's just inconceivable for Britain to do anything at all that defies the United States. Now, this is something that has been developing over many decades. But at least back, let's say, in the 1960s and 1970s, Britain had prime ministers such as Harold Wilson, who refused to go along and help the United States out in Vietnam, even though Lyndon Johnson wanted Britain to help out in Vietnam. And then we had Edward Heath, who famously refused to take part in the American airlift for Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But since then, and particularly since the era of Tony Blair, and Blair kind of signed on to the US war against Yugoslavia in 1999. That was a crucial step. We just simply brought Britain onto this American project. And then, of course, a few years later, he was a leading participant in the invasion of Iraq. So since then, you just don't have any leaders at all who dare to defy the United States. So whether you have Rishi Sunak or whether you have Keir Starmer, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, if you say, well, who's going to pursue a policy more obsequious, more subservient to the United States, Sunak or Starmer? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. But that's really the problem. Now, what's interesting is that if for one moment you were to allow the people to have a say, then they would say no to these wars. There's no problem, no desire for these wars at all in the UK. And a case in point is back in 2013, when the Obama administration leaned on Prime Minister David Cameron and say, yeah, let's go bomb Syria. You know, there's this, you know, we've got evidence, you know, poison gas attack. It was, of course, it was nonsense. But they said, yeah, let's go bomb Syria. And then David Cameron said, well, okay, fine. But just before we do, let's have a vote in Parliament about it. Well, the moment you put it to the vote in Parliament, of course, they said, no, we don't want to do it. We just don't want to do it. This is a crazy war. It's going to get Britain into an awful lot of hot water. It'll encourage terrorism and so on. And they voted against it. And so what conclusion did Britain's elites draw from that? Never again have a vote. And so when Theresa May joined President Trump in bombing Syria, she made sure not to have a vote beforehand to the House of Commons, because again, she would have lost the vote. So what happens is you don't have votes, because if people are allowed to vote, then they'll express their disgust with these policies. So unfortunately, Keir Starmer also learned his lesson. He's not going to allow this to have people who have the vote. I mean, that's kind of why he pushed aside Jeremy Corbyn, who was, you know, much loved within the party. But you know, the last thing you want is to allow the people to have a say.
Yeah, I think that they strongly want to convince people, which is their main slogan, that there is no alternative. Yeah, as you remember, sure. Who said that. And this is not only about economy, but also about the politics and about the geopolitical issues as well. And I'm afraid that it's a common problem, not only for the UK, but also for the whole Europe. As I remember last year, just after a couple months of this war, great research and great survey within European Union member states showed that 80% of the European Union population is strongly against the war. And in the same time, in the European Parliament, more than 80% of the members vote exactly opposite, for increasing any kind of war involvement, for increasing funds spent on the arms industry. Even in the last week, I believe, European Parliament voted again for increasing spending and a special fund for the European companies to sell more weapons, with additional points in in procedures with the weapon used against Ukraine or for democratic movement in Belarus. So we already know that democratic movement in Belarus would need European armament. Very interesting, especially that would be very peaceful movement, as we can easily guess. But it's not a problem in Europe. So let's return to Africa, to Dr. Membe, and I would like to emphasize the moment of Russia-Africa summit in July, 27-28 July in Petersburg. It was absolutely fantastic moment, but because it shows that the so-called international blockade, international sanctions against Russia are not international, but American European ones. So the minority of the global population only involved in minorities, only involved in this anti-Russia activity, anti-Russia policy, and in the same time, African countries and, well, especially African nations are involved in dialogue, in real pro-peace movement, would like to hold stronger economical relations with Russia, with China. And, well, I would say that it could be a hope for the world, not only hope for peace, but also hope for the multipolarity. And, well, we observe this anti-neocolonial wave in the Western Africa. Dr. Membe, do you think that such a resistance, such a fight like we observed in the Western African country could spread over Africa? Can Africa stand again against neocolonial oppression, stand against puppet governments in many African countries, and could take the place absolutely natural for so big continents with such a great, fantastic, especially people potential, but also, of course, economical potential? Dr. Membe, do you think that it's beginning of the true African spring?
It may not be an African spring as such, but colonialism, neo-colonialism, injustice in any form cannot last forever without being challenged. There has been heavy neo-colonialism, French neo-colonialism in West Africa, in the Francophone countries. And it's an illusion to think that the relationship that France had with those West African countries could last forever, could go on without being challenged. There is no injustice in the world that has lasted forever. So what we are seeing in West Africa, more countries where injustice prevails, where neo-colonial order prevails, it will be challenged. Why? Neo-colonialism deepens poverty, deepens unemployment, deepens inequality, is destructive to the environment. Such an order cannot last forever. No matter how long it lasts, it can never last forever. And wherever it exists on the continent of Africa, it will eventually be challenged. It may not take the form of military resistance or military coups we are seeing in West Africa. It may take other forms, but at the end of the day, it will be challenged. It will be resisted. The colonization of Africa was resisted. The neo-colonialism of Africa will also be resisted. What we are seeking is simply not just the removal of certain forms of injustice from one country to or another. It's the creation of a more just, more fair, and more humane world. Global solidarity is needed. Global unity is needed. We need that because also not one country on this planet can solve all its problems by itself. That's why even in the USA, in trying to deal with these problems, it recruits European partners, it recruits African puppets and agents to deal with his own problems. That type of unity, that type of cooperation can be changed into a more genuine, more humane form of solidarity that benefits all humanity. We are all on this planet like people traveling on a vessel on the high seas. If that all of you perish. The problems going on in Africa threaten all humanity. The poverty, the deepening poverty in Africa threatens peace and stability on this planet as a whole. The insurgents, the militants, the terrorism that breeds will always be felt in all parts of the world, and it's being felt. So there is need to cooperate. There is need to build international solidarity against these injustices, and indeed against the wars which it breeds. In a truly peaceful world, we would not have organizations like NATO. In a more fair world, we will not have colonialism and colonialism. This is what the African people are resisting. This is what is giving rise to what we are seeing in West Africa, and which will give rise to other parts of Africa where poverty is deepening, where injustice is the order of the day. And this will not only be in Africa, we will see it also, and we are seeing it in Latin America. It will be seen wherever there's injustice, wherever there's inequality. But we know that imperialism creates crises like this. It exploits them. Progressives of all revolutionaries in the world, this world order, an order that breeds inequality, an order that breeds unemployment, an order that breeds poverty in the world, and an order also that destroys the planet. And that's why we all have to say no to NATO's expansion, no to war in all its forms. We need a peaceful world. Wars are not good for humanity. They are not good for the poor. They are not good, especially for the marginalized Africans. We don't want wars. Yeah. I think for now.
Thank you very much indeed. That really moved me, and I said that experience of the country under neocolonial power is absolutely quite similar wherever it's in Africa, in South America, in South Asia, or even in Europe, in some elements, in Eastern Europe, especially in some elements, and now in Ukraine as well. And yeah, that's very important remark, that we all know that these are all elements of the same strategy. Creating food shortages, controlling food distribution, fake, false aid so-called, which is the only element of capitalist accumulation in Africa, and accumulation by dispossession in Africa. It's absolutely obvious for anyone who knows these forms of activity in the African market. So that's the moment you absolutely can be sure that every time the American and Anglo-Saxon, but also other neo-colonial powers say that they try to help the people, the only result is war and destruction and robbery on the massive scale, like we observe in Africa, like we observe now in Ukraine. Well, asking all our guests for final conclusions, I have just one reminding, one memory I'd like to share with you first, because when preparing to this broadcast, I had this impression that it's somehow similar for me, that I already read something like that about this famine, this great hunger, that these old histories are only Russia's fault, and I just get it. The same fake propaganda, the same fake blackmail with great famine was used by Nazis, but Ukrainian Nazis during the Second World War and just after that, when they created the story about so-called Holodomor, false story about how Russian Soviet government created hunger just to kill innocent Ukrainians, which is absolutely not true in any aspect, but it was created by Goebbels propaganda. Now it's, of course, official ideology in the Zelensky Ukraine, because it's a straight line between Ukrainian Nazis and present Kiev government. And in the same time, when what was the purpose of this propaganda in the 40s and after the war? In the 40s, my people my family living in the eastern Poland observed how German Nazi occupiers just taken from Ukraine whole wagons with the Charnozem, the richest soil in Europe, which was directly in bags and with whole transport was sent to Germany. So in the same situation like we have now. They call us about famine. They call us about the hunger. They call us about the food shortages, which are, of course, only resulted in Russian politics. And in the same time, they grab the land, they grab the grain, they grab all the wealth of Ukraine, the same like they did before in Africa, in every part of the world when stood Anglo-Saxon imperialistic foot. Dear friends, we of course do not solve all the problems tonight, but thank you very much for your activity, for your participation, and please, just in the last thoughts, how do you think would this Ukrainian grain blackmail could be solved in the best interest of the people in Ukraine, in the best interest of the people in Europe, best people of the people in Africa, best people in the interest of people of all the world? What is your answer? What is your solution for this stage of this absolutely fatal and tragic crisis? Dr. Edwards, what's your opinion?
Comrade, I think I'd like to remind the audience that not only did Monsanto create Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, they also created the Terminator technology, which was to be used with this Roundup Ready soya, and which means that farmers aren't able to save their seed and their grain from one year to the next, which has a massively negative impact on food security in whatever place these grains have been used. And in India, I believe people have really stood up against this type of technology because it leads to starvation. So I think the other point to make is, of course, that the USDA and the FDA have been completely captured by these global agribusiness corporates. And I saw this when I used to work for the landowning organization in the UK at the end of the 90s, in the mid 90s and the end of the 90s, when the Americans were trying to push this technology onto Europe. So I think people need to be aware of that. Also, the World Food Programme is, of course, controlled by the United States. And it is possible, therefore, for the US to weaponize food distributions and have an even worse effect, therefore, on global food security. So I believe the way forward is really, ultimately, it is sustainable agriculture, which is in the hands of local people, instead of this global agribusiness where it's just about profits and weaponizing food and agriculture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr.
And well, I would like also ask for this final conclusions, Dr. Szamuely. George, what do you think? Can we solve that?
Yeah, well, if you look back at the Black Sea Grain Initiative, it had two prongs to it, which was that Ukraine would get its grain out through the Black Sea with the assistance of Turkey. But Russia also would be able to export its grain and its fertilizer. But as often happens when you're dealing with the West, with NATO and the EU, they always forget the second part of the deal. It's always, they remember the one part of the deal, the one that interests them, that they care passionately about. The second part, which was that Russia needed to get its grain out, that they forgot about. And of course, again, this massive propaganda campaign led by Josep Borrell and the rest, who said, no, this is Russians are lying. The Russians are liars. They're liars. They're liars. It's not true. Russian food is not under sanction. Well, no, it's true. Russian food is not under sanction. But if Russia has difficulties docking at ports and leaving ports, if Russia cannot get insurance on the international insurance markets, then basically, and Russia has no ability to conduct transactions because of they've been cut off the SWIFT system, then effectively Russian food is under sanction. And so this is the problem with NATO, is that they do this propaganda, the media pick it up. Oh, of course, the Russians are lying. No, the grain is not under sanction. No, but everything else is. And if everything else is under sanction, you can't get the grain out. So my point is that agreement could have worked. But instead, NATO chose not to pursue the agreement. And then, of course, when Russia inevitably, and it was obviously inevitable that Russia would say that enough already, you haven't fulfilled the terms of the agreement, then they say, oh, Russia is causing starvation in the world. Russia is weaponizing food. Russia is, starving the people. Well, of course, when you talk about weaponizing, the weaponizing is all being done by the West, just like the energy was done by the West. The West weaponized energy by saying, we're cutting off. We're not going to purchase any more oil, gas, coal, whatever. Well, you're weaponizing, and that's what you're weaponizing. So in the same way that by imposing these sanctions, it was the West that was weaponizing food. So when you ask what's the solution, well, I think if the terms of the Black Sea Grain Initiative were now to be fulfilled, I think that would be a good start. I don't think it's going to happen, because I just don't think that the Americans in particular, and they're usually calling the shots, the Americans have no real interest in sticking with this agreement. The Europeans do. I mean, it is a European problem, but the Americans are the driving force, and this is of no real interest to them.
Yeah, well, I would say that even more, because this Black Sea agreement about the export-import allowance could of course, was planned as a first step to the peace agreement at all. And we perfectly remember that it was the time when Boris Johnson came to Kiev and just forbidden Zelensky to sign that peace agreement, or even armistice with Russia. But remember, if I can ask you for final conclusions, and what is the hope? What is the hope we can give people now in these very hard times?
Indeed, these are very hard times. In the beginning, we used to worry so much about mining corporations colonizing us and continuing the neo-colonialism. Zambia, the country in which I live, was first colonized by a mining corporation in 1891. Today, our food security, our food sovereignty, our seed security, our seed sovereignty is being undermined by agricultural companies like Monsanto. When you don't have sovereignty over your food, you cannot be said to be a free country. We are a neo-colony of Monsanto and others. And when you are a neo-colony, vulnerable when it comes to food. Food insecurity, lack of food sovereignty is worse than having your minerals being taken away. You don't eat minerals. Food you eat. Today we don't have control over the seed that we use. It's controlled by Monsanto. Our food sovereignty has been destroyed, has been undermined. We should wage the struggle that is required to restore our food sovereignty, to restore our seed sovereignty. Without that, we'll continue to be vulnerable. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that, as we all know, some unfamous British politicians said that whoever do not control food supplies cannot be treated as a serious geopolitical subject. Well, we can add that it's also cannot be treated as a sovereign state, because totalitarian control over food supply is one of the final steps of the humanity enslavement, and we observe that also during COVID crisis, during energy transition crisis, and now during the war. And we all see involvement of the neoliberal global corporations in the food industry, or food chemical industry, however we can call that. Well, I think that opposing not only the American Ukrainian grain blackmail, but also opposing any kind of this food transition in the world is absolutely basic, not only for rescuing our lives or our still of life, but also our basic rights, because, well, whoever controls supplies, control the supply of bread, decide about the freedom and life of others. And I would conclude with one very important sentence of the one very clever man, that all we need for now is peace, land, and bread. And this is still program very up to date, the same like in the time of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. That was 9th broadcast of No2Nato movement. Sorry for all mistakes I made, as you can hear, not only language one, and for some technical issues we already had. But, well, we are in fight. We are in fight for peace, land, and bread. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank especially our noble guests. Thank you, Dr. Howard. Thank you, Dr. Szamuely. Thank you, Dr. Membe. And I hope we'll see soon on the next No2Nato broadcast. Please remember to subscribe our channel. Please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Telegram channel. We have to create the international network for peace. No to NATO, no to war. Thank you very much, my friends. Thank you very much, comrades.